Hello, romantics. I'm Sarah Gomez, author, romance lover, and host. You're listening to Romancing the Story, a podcast centered around writing, reading, and story structure, all with a twist of romance. We're at episode 68, and on today's episode, I speak with romance author Melissa Whitney about writing outside our lived-in experience, due diligence as authors to the disabled community, and investing in sensitivity readers. She released her debut novel, In the Hello and in the Goodbye, a romance about challenges of maintaining a relationship through adversity and distance. We chatted about how writing disabilities isn't a monolith, and how thorough research combined with pulling from different experiences can create an authentic character. We even delve a bit into how the debut pulled from her own love story involving neurodivergence, writing a non-linear storyline, and why she chose to publish this story first over the 6 other novels she will release in the next 2 years. Links to connect to Melissa, find her book, as well as other media mentioned will be listed in the episode description. I do use some Amazon affiliate links, so if you buy through the link, it helps the podcast and is always appreciated. With that said, let's jump right in. Welcome, romance author Melissa Whitney. Yay!
Yay!
I'm so excited, Miss Melissa. You've kind of listened to the podcast for a little bit. So in case listeners don't know, can you tell them a little bit about yourself and your writing?
Absolutely. I feel like I want to say long-time listener, first-time caller.
Yeah.
For those who don't know me, I'm Melissa Whitney. And yeah, I'm a romance writer. It's weird to say that, or excuse me, I was told I'm not allowed to say weird anymore. Surreal.
There you go. I like that.
My friend said, you can't say it anymore. You got to say it's surreal. It's surreal to say that because it's been a journey. It feels like it's been a long journey, but also a whirlwind. Like everyone else, I loved writing as a kid, and I had those notebooks, and I would write poetry and short stories and all that stuff, and I always wanted to be a writer. But like everyone else, I told myself it was probably not in the future. Like I'm not good enough, and all of those, stories we tell ourselves. And then compounding that, I have an eye condition called retinitis pigmentosa, or RP, which causes you to lose your vision completely. And so I was thinking writing is maybe not something that is financially stable at times. I need to make sure that I am financially stable as a person with a disability. So I went into healthcare and got my master's in social work. And I've worked in healthcare for the last 15 years, first doing direct patient care. And then the last 10 years working in healthcare management and leadership, and was part of a leadership team in a hospital here in Southern California when the pandemic hit. And I was a little busy. Like a lot of people, books were my refuge, and I did a lot of reading. And because I'm blind, I take public transportation. So I was going to and from the hospital in a pandemic on the bus. I fell in love with books again, and it rekindled my love of writing. And I read a book by John Cleese about creativity. And in the summer of 2022, I said, I think I have an idea for a story, which ultimately became In the Hello and in the Goodbye, my debut novel. And I said something to my husband, and he was like, do it. 100% supportive. Sat down and tried to write the first book, had an outline, couldn't write it. Then I ended up writing a different book, which comes out in July. Reached out to Juliet Cross, who was amazing and gave me an editor, Gemma Mercado. And between podcasts like Romancing the Story, the workshops, the conferences, reading critique groups, I have just hit the ground running. And now I've got 6 books that are coming out in the next 2 years, and I'm in the middle of writing book number 7. So it's been a whirlwind, but also like a lifetime to get here.
Wow. So within the 2 years, did you have like some stage of writing for each book, for each of those 6 books?
Yeah. So when
Oh,
I
wow.
finished Finding Home, which is the book that comes out in July,
Hmm.
it was in editing when I sat down to write In the Hello and in the Goodbye. And as I was finishing In the Hello and in the Goodbye, I was already starting to outline the next book. And so that's my process. I have a book in some stage of the process. Like, and it's funny because it's like right now I have three projects that I'm kind of focused in on. I have one that was in editing, one that was in proofing, and now one that I'm, currently drafting. So, you're kind of like balancing three different worlds, but that's kind of the way I've worked as an author at least the last 2 years.
That is so impressive. That I know you mentioned you listened to Romancing the Story, which I thank you. Thank you very much. But that sounds exactly like Lauren Smith, who I interviewed, like I think it was last year. She had a process just like that. And man, kudos to you guys. I don't know if I could live that life, but I have so much respect for you guys who could do that.
The book I have been editing is my first person present tense because I tend to write third person past
Oh.
tense. So
Hmm.
I was editing that with my editor, proofing my book that comes out in July that is third person, and then writing a book that's in third person. So I had to like mentally go, wait, what tense am I in right now?
Yeah, you got to like mentally shift gears just to go
Mhm.
from like one book to the next. That's incredible. Like I said, just amazing. Six books in like this period of like 2 years. That's phenomenal. So congrats on your debut. Just came out, right? In the hello and in
Yes.
the goodbye. The book is a contemporary second chance romance with a kind of a non-linear exploration of one couple's romantic journey, neurodivergency and all. So you also have other books kind of like we mentioned, that are currently in the works and that are inclusive for mental health rep and characters with disabilities. What inspired you to write romances with main characters that are differently abled?
Oh, well, I mean, as I mentioned, I'm a legally blind woman. So
Mhm.
disability is every aspect of my life, right? It's not the sole sum of who I am as a person, but it's a big part of who I am. I'm also a disabled woman who's married to an autistic man. And my husband, like home in the Hello and in the Goodbye, is autistic and also a special ed teacher. So I remember when my mother-in-law read the book, she was like, huh, is this based off of my son? And I was like, yeah. She's like, I'm gonna be skipping some of the parts in this book. But disability is very much a part of my life, as well as mental health. I have complex PTSD from past trauma, which I'll be exploring in Finding Home. And so um, these are like common stories, common experiences that so many have that aren't necessarily fully embraced within the literary world. I think romance, especially, is becoming more and more inclusive to the multiple paths of experience that people have and how that can shade the experience of love. And in so many ways, um, I, as a disabled woman, have the same experience as an able bodied woman when it comes to love, but then also I have a different experience because of my disability when it comes to love. And so I wanted to highlight that and show that there's similarities in experience, but also differences. And really, I think having more positive representation and accurate representation really helps transform people's perceptions of people with disabilities, especially looking at them as, viable romantic partners, which is something a lot of people with disabilities really struggle with. I mean, I remember when I was dating and having like my meet cute and having my white cane, and the guy that'd be on the date with would go, "Wait, what's this?" So it was like this whole conversation. But if you normalize people with disabilities being out dating, you start to normalize that experience where it isn't so, uncomfortable or awkward for people.
Well, and I love that you bring that up because that is something that I've kind of seen with my friends. So fun fact, my roommate in college, who's one of my best like lifelong friends, is legally blind.
Mm-hmm.
So I saw him struggle with that, like trying to date kind of and like all the questions he got and kind of invasively of like from other people. And I remember too, we just didn't think about some of the things. And like one time we rearranged furniture and we forgot to tell him he kind of bumped into things. And it wasn't until I heard him bump into it, I was like, oh, I'm so sorry, Sergio. Like when I see like disabled characters or characters that are differently abled, I see my friends.
I like to say, disabled people deserve to be the star of every love story, especially their own.
Yes. Hmm.
Um, but it's funny that you say that because the book that comes out in October, At First Smile, which is my first legally blind female main character. So of course I am very, very excited about this as a legally
Aw.
blind woman who's never got to see herself be the lead of a book. I mean, there are blind characters in disability, some of them done very well, some of them not done so well. But I've never seen like a legally blind character, because usually they are totally blind. And there is a scene where Penn, who's the main character, she has to tell Rowan, the main male character, to put his shoes by the door. And he's like, what? And she's like, well, I don't want to trip on them in the middle of the night. And it's things like that. And I remember when my husband and I, the first time we had a sleepover, I had to say like, hey honey, your shoes need to go by the door so I don't trip over them. And he was like, oh. So it's things you don't think about.
Exactly. It's those like little connect the dots of like, of course, that makes total sense. But like we just sometimes don't think about it. And
Mm-hmm.
I love that you brought up too that romance is such like a fun genre and it's really become more nuanced, especially with the conversations we're having. Like I think it is like just the perfect time to, like you said, bring in a female protagonist who is legally blind, to have like a main male character who also is on the spectrum. So, as writers, I feel like we have a great impact and responsibility to readers and can help shape accurate and inaccurate portrayals of real groups of people. What steps did you take to authentically portray characters with disabilities?
I mean, so people think like, oh, you're disabled, so you're going to just be able to do it. No, because disability is like not a monolith. It's like a rainbow of people.
Hmm.
And even within autism, which my husband is autistic, but autism is a spectrum and everybody is like, has different experiences and different ways in which their autism shows itself within that spectrum. So of course I based the character of Colm in the Hello and in the Goodbye, who is an autistic man, on my husband, because I was like, well, right here in front of me. It's
Fair.
like, thank you, honey. A lot, I've had 15 years of us together as research for this book. But I spent a lot of time within the autism community. We work with organizations out here where we live in Southern California, social events specific for people on the autism spectrum. I'm part of a mutual aid group for individuals who have partners who are on the autism spectrum. So having community with folks within the autism community, interactions, doing research, reading books, and of course paying attention to what autistic folks are saying. I think whenever you are going to write disability, or anytime you're going to write outside of your lived experience, first you have to ask yourself, do you already platform and support this community? Are you already reading books by folks from the community who tell their own stories? Are you supporting their stories? And then if you're doing that, then are you doing your due diligence to make sure that you're providing authenticity to that story with really thorough research, interacting with the community, and then also sensitivity readers. I worked with sensitivity readers to ensure that I was having a thoughtful representation of a adult man on the autism spectrum. And I think that's the approach that you should always take. And even with my portrayal of Penn in At First Smile, who is a legally blind woman, I'm a legally blind woman. So it's like, oh, well, not a lot of research, right? I still made sure that I had to do my research and look into things and make sure that I'm accurately representing my community as a member of that community. So I think being thoughtful in this process is, I think, important anytime you're going to write outside your own lived experience.
Well, and I love that you bring that up, that you even did research as a part of like even your character that you personally kind of like identify with, as far as like the being legally blind, because you still understood that there's a representation there and
Mhm.
kind of encompassing it. I love you mentioned it's not a monolith, because I do think too that there is different experiences. Everyone has a different lived in experience based on culture and environment and things like that. I always think to myself, okay, like how can I give the true representation, but also kind of like take creative liberties? Like where did that kind of line kind of come for you? Was that in the sensitivity readers giving you feedback?
One, of course, sensitivity readers giving me feedback, but also, immersing myself in the community, right, and hearing the different stories and the different experiences of people within the community, and even just my own experience as a person with a disability, understanding that I'm still not going to fit the mold. There's no mold. There's no mold. There's no archetype for an autistic man. There's no archetype for a blind woman. There's no archetype for an able-bodied woman or a disabled non-binary person. Like there's no archetype. And I think once you understand that and you really get into interacting with folks within the community, I think that helps you kind of create your character that is maybe a hodgepodge of different people's experiences. And I think people within the community can then really identify and see pieces of themselves. They might not see themselves fully. Like, I don't think every person who is within the autism community is going to see themselves in home completely, because their experience as an autistic person might be very different, but they might still see a piece of themselves within home, if that makes sense.
And that's a great way to kind of encompass, I feel like, more experiences, right? And more kind of like pieces of the puzzle. I like how you said too, like there's no like there's not one specific way, because that was, I think, one thing me and my roommate kind of saw with my own roommate who is legally blind. I remember one lady came up to him and said, "You don't look legally blind." And we looked at her like, how are they supposed to look?
I get that all the time. Like
Like,
we went on a double date recently with a couple that my husband knew the wife from Toastmasters, and we went to dinner, and someone said, "Oh, I didn't realize you were blind." Well, you don't look blind. And I just said, "Well, I forgot to wear my I'm blind t-shirt today." And they kind of looked at me for a minute, and then they laughed about it because they realized, they're like, "Oh yeah, faux pas." And I was like, "Yeah, it's all right." Sometimes you gotta have a little bit of a smart alecky sense of humor about it. But yeah, it's funny how often you get that.
but yeah, he got stuff like that all the time. And so it was just kind of wild to kind of see. So that was something I've always thought was very interesting when I see like these experiences, especially in like the fictional world.
Well, I think that's why the representation is so important, because once
Mhm.
you've seen that in a book, and then the next time you interact with somebody from that community, you'll be a little bit more mindful of that. Or if you see that, you'll be like, "That's not cool."
I had actually talked to a friend about when we had done another podcast episode. I haven't released it yet, but we had actually talked about. She is also a disabled woman who runs her own business. We were talking about verbiage, like
Hmm.
what's the proper verbiage? Because I know that there are different types of verbiage, and there were like things I didn't even know, as far as like it's super faux pas to ask someone what their disability was, and I didn't know that. And sometimes you just don't know what you don't know.
Yeah. Well, and the language has changed a lot. When I was going through my master's program, it was person first language, person with a disability, you know, person with visual impairment. And it has since changed in the last 5 years to kind of a reclaiming and very much like an activist mindset of disabled no longer being like a dirty word, right? And kind of a
Mhm.
reclaiming of that. And even my husband refers to himself as an autistic man, right? And when I was going through grad school, it was person on the spectrum, or person with autism, again, person first language. And again, that's shifted. And you still see that within the community, especially like geriatric millennials like myself and Gen Xers. We still kind of sometimes use the person first verbiage that we had been kind of trained to do. And then a lot of, Gen Zers are like, using like disabled or blind, to describe themselves, or autistic. So it's been interesting. So even when you're within the community, you're like, wait, what verbiage? And so I always tell people, like, always, be inquiry, just inquire, ask questions, listen, and you'll figure it out.
So there can be wild amounts of misinformation that can easily get widespread or hurtful stereotypes perpetuated through different media. My kiddo, I'm trying to teach her right now, TikTok does not have all the answers and is not like the end all be all. Not everything is true. So, so sometimes it comes down to simply not knowing, right? We kind of mentioned that. I mentioned that a little earlier. What's something other people often get wrong or misinterpret about disabilities?
Oh my gosh, that our lives are so sad that we need somebody to fix us, right? That is such a trope. I'm gonna get,
You
get on my
go, girl.
soapbox right
You
now.
go, girl.
I'm gonna get feisty. That is such a trope, and it frustrates me. And it's a common trope we see it is in romance and in something we still see today, where the person with the disability, they're very sad about it. Their only issue is that they have a disability, right? And
Yes.
then that able-bodied person is going to come into their life and teach them how to be okay with their disability. And I'm not gonna name names, but there's a number of books, and I'm sure you can think of books that you've read that kind of lean into that trope, and they think that it's good disability representation, but it actually is doing greater harm, because it's perpetuating this myth that your life is like so sad. I mean, I don't know if your friend had this, but I can count on my hand how many times a day when I leave the house somebody comes up to me and says, "Oh, you poor thing, I'm going to pray for you." And my husband every time is like, "Oh, he knows I'm going to pick and choose my battles. Sometimes I'll just say thank you, or I'll, tease back and go, 'Oh, thank goodness someone's praying for me.'" But
It's
that is
funny.
such a common trope that gets used, especially in the romance world. And it especially gets used by people who I think feed into stereotypes and maybe didn't do their due diligence. And when they're an able-bodied writer who is writing outside of their lived experience, they tend to kind of feed into these common narratives. And again, I think they're meaning to do what's right, but intentions and impact are always two very different things.
It was one of those things of like, yes, that it doesn't define you, like your whole
Mm-hmm.
personality. Like it seems like that's kind of what some media wants to do is like, let's make this whole thing. There's this one aspect of their life, their whole personality.
Right. I for once I want to see the story where the disabled person is the one who brings the able-bodied person out of their depression. Like not the opposite that we always see, but you're absolutely correct.
You are onto something. I want you to write that right now.
There's a lot of elements of that in At First Smile. I mean, we've got kind of a you know a hockey player who is in a very funky mood because he got himself in trouble at the end of the season, and he meets this little feisty whirlwind legally blind woman in an airport. And yeah, it's definitely got elements of that. I will say that was, oh my gosh, I had so much fun writing that like book. I'm so excited. It's with the proofer right now, and I'm like, I can't wait for this book to come out. It's probably the best thing I've written. I'm so in love with this story and these two characters because they were perfect for each other.
Well, and if you had like kind of different books in different stages, what kind of made you decide like in the hello and in the goodbye to release that one first? I'm just kind
Oh
of
my
curious.
gosh. So well, because Finding Home, I was actually working with a publisher. And I didn't actually think I was going to find a publisher that would be open to In the Hello and In the Goodbye. You know, it's a little bit of a slow burn. The beginning, I think kind of isn't like pop. I mean, I think you get to the point real quick, but it isn't like grabs you real quick. We're like, oh, and it wasn't really like anything that I had seen at the time. It was dual timeline, dual POV. You have a main male character who is on the autism spectrum. You have
Hmm.
a female main character who, yeah, she's a little bit of a sunshine, but she's like a chatterbox, and sometimes can be a little annoying because it's kind of based off of me, and I'm a little bit of a chatterbox. But these two characters were also deeply flawed, and both had a lot of emotional work that they had to do, and I think the subject matter. I was afraid that the book also couldn't like fit one category because it wasn't like only emotion and it wasn't only comedy. So I made a decision. I was like, I'm going to independently publish this one. And it was ready to go. And I just felt really strongly about the story. And I had gotten really great positive reception from beta readers who were excited about it, that I just said, this is going to be my first one.
Mm.
And then I just gave myself a long road to like I started talking about the book and I did my cover reveal in September. And then the book came
Nice.
out April 2nd. So I gave myself a long road to get here so that I could do marketing and all of this stuff, and also give myself a chance to talk myself out of it in case I wanted to do that.
And I thought it was amazing. So I'm really surprised that you're just like, oh no, the next one's even better. So I'm just like really excited. That was something kind of, you mentioned the non-linear kind of like narrative. You kind of have two different timelines going on. That was something I actually really enjoyed about the book. Like it kind of had this like non-linear aspect. It's kind of what's interesting to kind of see what kind of came before and like what came after, and kind of like we as the audience were kind of along for the ride, kind of with the messy middle, kind of helping decipher what kind of happened, like along with the characters, which is really, really interesting, and how they get back to being a loving couple. How did you decide to write a non-linear narrative? And I know this is going to sound wild, but bear with me. My husband's ADHD. So like, was it all based on neurodivergence?
No, I think that's a great question. So I liked the idea. So I'm a big person who like, I know people like to use the onion analogy of like the
Hmm.
layers. I don't use that because I'm allergic to onions, but I like to use the croissant, like every flaky layer. I think I used it a couple of times in my books. My editors told me I can't use that. I can't use that metaphor anymore. So I like stories that are layered, right? Where you're finding out things as you're going along, right? And kind of unveiling itself. And you can do that with a linear format. But I like the idea of like there's all this backstory of how this couple got to where they are. And a lot of times when we have stories about relationships in peril, we get a little bit of that up front, or we just get like tiny tidbits. And it's like, why are we why are we rooting for this couple, right? And so I thought, if I tell a non-linear story and I weave in their falling in love with their falling apart, I'm going to have the couple have the reader have an experience where they're both falling in love with this couple, and then also their heart is breaking because they're seeing what's happening to them. And that's been the feedback that I've gotten or got from a lot of readers, is that they're falling madly in love with this couple, and then at the same time their hearts are being ripped out because of the in the goodbye chapters. And I like, I'm sorry, but go for the ride. And I thought that would be an interesting way of telling their story, and having you understand how this couple got to where they got, right? Not just their kind of breaking point, but also why they would fight for this relationship, right? Because a lot of times when you see stories with relationships in peril, you're thinking, well, why are they fighting for this? Well, I wanted to make sure I could tell that story in a way that would be engaging to the reader, and also help you better see who they were as people. Because I think if I only told the linear story at the beginning, I don't think people would have had as much empathy for both Evie and Colm as they went through their journey, as they do with how the story was written.
I think it was perfectly told the way it was, because I feel like I got to see also like kind of what drew them apart. Like you said, it was a little heartbreaking because then I get to the in the hello kind of pieces and I'd be like, oh, they're so sweet, and it's so lovely. And then all of a sudden we're in the goodbye and they're like kind of cold and distant. But
Mhm.
but those are kind of the ebb and flows of every relationship, a lot of it. So it was really interesting to kind of weave that story and kind of see where they were both working, like you said, both working on themselves because they had a lot going on.
Mhm.
between themselves that they had not yet unpacked, because we always have the warm, real loving feelings, those warm fuzzies, like usually, when we first have love, but then after a while it's just like, it's you again, that kind of that kind of love.
Right. Right. Oh yeah, you live here.
Oh yeah, like, oh yeah, it's you again. So, but it's so lovely to see how that kind of ebbed and flowed. Like I was kind of mentioning, like the ebb and flow of it all, and like kind of seeing it kind of, where did we go wrong? Where can we kind of fix this? And kind of the slow kind of, it was never like all at once. It was just kind of, because that's what we kind of always think of. It's just like it all happens all at once. It's always kind of like the slow kind of erosion of things.
Mhm.
Really interested in like the way you were writing it, because to me I was like, man, I don't know if I could keep track of two timelines. I have hard enough time with one. So was the process looked really like was it hard keeping track?
Yes and no.
Ooh.
I guess yes, in the sense is I wanted to make sure like the time everything was correct and there was consistency. So, making sure going through with editing and all of that before it even went to my editor to make sure that I was consistent with timelines and what was happening, who was there, all of that. But then also no, because it all fed into each other. I have I'm like a little bit of a pantser and a little bit of a plotter. So I have a general outline, and then I allow the story to breathe. And so when I first sat down to write the story, I didn't have an idea of it being um, this, like with the dual timeline. But then as I stepped back from when I first started writing it, I couldn't really get into the story. So I stepped back and I wrote Finding Home. And when I came back to this, I knew at that point the reason why I was struggling was because I had those missing pieces. And that was why I then changed to the dual timeline. And then I had very specific points I had to hit. And each of those points pushed the story in the here and now further along, because it helped you not just see what was happening or what led them to, but even just like the little pieces, like not to give any spoilers, but the Korgmas party scene, right?
Mm.
There was pieces of what's happening now. Those seeds were planted there where you saw kind of like their first fight, right? And you get these little things throughout. And so I was trying to be very thoughtful in that process and make sure that the flashback chapters were all about feeding into the here and now, not just telling the story of how they fell in love, but also telling the story of how they got to this place where it seemed like they were so broken that they wouldn't make it as a couple, but also that they had the tools, if they really used them, to be able to come back as a couple, and that there was something worth fighting for.
And see, like that's what we all want, that love worth fighting for.
That's why it's the second half of the book is called The Fight. Because they were fighting for each other, and they were really fighting for themselves. So it was a lot of fun to write, even though it
Yeah.
was, I'm not gonna lie, there was a lot of crying during this book.
Aw. Yeah, I could see that though, because I mean, like you said, there is the person that a little bit of like, it's your first book, baby, first off, and it is like it's personal.
Some of what Evie and Cole went through, my husband and I went through, and we had a really struggly period during the first year of marriage where we didn't think we were going to make it. And I can share this now because we are very, very much in our HEA, and he, having read the book, um, just, one of the big takeaways for him was, oh my gosh, look at where we're at and where we used to be. And we're like, I know. And that's why I'm like, if anyone ever says this ending is unrealistic, I'll be like, we are the proof that it's not. But I think every author does that. They put a bit of themselves, while there's still a lot of fictional stuff in here. Like, we don't have a corgi. We have two pugs.
Aw.
But this was a very deeply personal story. And that's why when I decided to write this, I talked to him and I said, I'm going to use a lot of elements from our experience. And he was like, absolutely. He's like, because I think this is a story worth telling, and it's a story that a lot of people are going to connect, and an experience that a lot of couples have, that I think will be healing for them to know that they're not so alone, and that they can come out the other side of a traumatic event and be even stronger.
Right. And it does, like, you feel a lot of the love and care that you put into like every piece of this. Like I love the way that you put so much consideration into Calm,
Mhm.
who's like the main male character. And like you said, kind of a little bit based on your husband, in regards to being and how he's on the spectrum and how it affects a lot of his interactions, romantic and otherwise.
Mhm.
Holm might have a literal mind and rituals to help manage stressors, but he still had the great propensity to be a loving, passionate, and just thoughtful person. How did you go about creating a differently abled, complex character with emphasis on their unique personalities and challenges?
I mean, one being a person who is disabled, that is unique in my own experience and very complex. Although my husband teases him very simply. He's like, all I need to do is get a bakery and you're fine. It's always this joke whenever we go on vacation. He's like, there's a bakery, you'll be fine. But I think understanding that from my own perspective of my own life as a person with a disability is ensuring that there's depth in character, and that no matter what the aspects of your characters are, that is just the aspects of who they are and not the sum of who they are. So
Mm,
my Elle Davidson, who is the character in my book that's coming out in July, is a survivor of trauma. And while trauma is a very big part of the story, it is not the only note in her character. And so I think I take that approach with all my characters, and I kind of create who they are. What do they like to drink? What do they wear? You get all those tidbits about Holm throughout the book, so that he isn't just like the very literal guy on the autism spectrum. Like, you find out that he has all these things he enjoys. He's also very sweet. He constantly is bringing Evie her favorite treats, and just very thoughtful and very much a service, shows his love through, acts of service. So thinking about those things, like what is their love language? What things do they enjoy eating, drinking? Who's their best friend? Like, once you have kind of all of those aspects of who a character is, then you can kind of create somebody who is multidimensional and not just, okay, well, I wrote a blind girl and that's it. Like Penn, who's my character in At First Smile, like she has all of these other aspects of who her personality is. And then I weave those into the story so that you see that they are more than just one thing. And I think whatever that, you know, characteristic is that you want to have as part of your character, it should always only be a part and not just everything.
You're also a romance writer. You work in healthcare. You do all these amazing things. It isn't just one thing. So
Yeah,
just like for everyone else. So,
absolutely. And I think that's the approach with any character. Like, so
mhm.
just anytime you're writing a character, no matter what, who they are, what their background is, just, you write a fully fleshed out character. And then, those are all like building blocks to who they are. So
Mm.
I kind of take the same approach, but anytime again, I'm writing outside of my learned experience, I'll spend a little bit more time doing the research, than I would do about, like, even though I did do some research for Penn, but and for L. But with Colm, I spent a little bit more time, especially too, because he's a man. And last time I checked, I'm a woman. So I had to spend a lot of time getting into the male point of view for that book too, which was a scary place.
Well, and you bring up a great point because, well, like you said, autism is a spectrum anyway, so no two people are going to be the same. But I went through several classes being a foster mom, and actually one of our foster kiddos did have autism.
Mhm.
And so like that was something I learned quite a bit about is that, autism in boys looks different than autism in girls. And like
Mhm.
they manifest themselves like differently. There's different like things you have to that might be triggers or there might be might overwhelm them, things like that. So like it was very interesting to kind of see like the full breadth of that, to really learn a lot and kind
Mhm.
of like it just opened my eyes because I knew autism was a spectrum anyway, but it can get down even to like the gender. sometimes,
Yeah.
like of what looks different. So it is like, yes, absolutely. 100% research is your best friend. Being curious is a very good trait to have as a writer.
Absolutely. Well, and as you said earlier too, your gender, your race, your class, your
Mhm.
religion, your ethnic background, your country of origin, all of those can shade your experience as a person with a disability. And just as they shade your experience as a person who doesn't have a disability. So,
Mhm.
absolutely correct. Colm is a heterosexual cis white male. He's going to have a very different experience than a Black LGBTQ plus person might have who is also on the autism spectrum. So,
Mhm.
it's important to really pay attention to that when you're doing your research and understand that, the experience looks very different based on all of these other prisms that make up the kaleidoscope in which somebody experiences the world.
So, what's a good way to help avoid unintentional ableism in our writing?
Ooh. I think staying current on, the language, the literature, looking at the literature, maybe following some influencers that are within the disability community and hearing how they speak and how they refer. I follow a number of social media influencers on the TikTok and on the Instagram. I
Mhm.
don't know why I would say I think it's funny. My husband says it makes me sound like I'm 110, but whatever. Um, but I follow a number of disability social media influencers. And some are autistic, some are wheelchair users, some have chronic illness, some are blind like myself. So just, sometimes following, listening, paying attention, immersing yourself a little bit more in the culture, and then also working with a sensitivity reader. I would say that anytime you were writing outside of your lived experience, even if it is not your main character, it is really important that you do your research, and it is important to invest in a sensitivity reader. And I know sensitivity readers can be very expensive and sometimes even more expensive than an editor, but it is a good investment. Or, if you truly cannot, working with folks who are members of that community who'd be willing to do a sensitivity read, and making sure too, like when you look at sensitivity readers, like I had multiple sensitivity readers in this book because I had characters who were of Hispanic background. And again, I am a white heterosexual cis woman. So I had sensitivity readers for my Hispanic characters. I had sensitivity readers for my LGBTQ plus characters, so that I made sure that I was doing my due diligence. And they saw things differently than my sensitivity readers for my autistic character. And they looked for different things. And it was interesting too to even see kind of a little bit of ableism that came out with some other sensitivity readers about the character of Colm. So that was kind of fascinating. But I do believe like sensitivity readers and making sure the sensitivity reader that you're working with is from that community or can really like speak to that community's experience. They are very much a valuable resource. But I do understand, especially for anyone who's independently published, or even if you're working with a small publishing company, and they might not be willing to pay for a sensitivity reader. I think it pays off in the long run because you don't want to unintentionally do greater harm to a community that you're hoping to support, both with your main characters and with your secondary characters.
Exactly. It is a worthwhile investment to have sensitivity readers. And I know I've kind of mentioned it with on other episodes, other podcast episodes, but a
Mhm.
friend of mine had actually said, and she was the one I kind of mentioned earlier, actually. She has her own business and she is also a disabled woman. She had mentioned to me that she's like, listen, if you can't afford that, that's perfectly fine. We all understand we're all in crunch time here in the economy,
Mhm.
but you can trade off sometimes. Like
Oh,
reach out to your writer networks. Yeah. And like if I said like, Melissa, I just have, you know what? I've sent this on to Sergio, who's also legally blind, but I need your perspective too, to kind of because I want to write a legally blind character. So
yeah.
like I could maybe give it to you and you can say like, well, I have like a Hispanic podcast host. So how about I send it to you? Sound like perfect.
Absolutely. I mean, and I will say, I paid for one sensitivity reader, but that's how I found another one. Was I did one of those it was one of those beta groups on Facebook where, it's
Oh,
like, hey, you
yes.
read mine, I read yours. And I specifically said, hey, I'm looking for this. And they said, perfect. Would you also read this? They didn't need a sensitivity read. They just wanted my perspective as a romance reader. And we did that. And we were able to give each other really valuable notes. So I tell other writers, and even if you're thinking about going the traditionally published route, still invest in the time of getting things edited and sensitivity read, and beta groups like that or fellow author friends are a great resource for doing that, and investing in that even before you send it out to a literary agent, because any type of inaccuracy or insensitivity in the way in which you're presenting stories, especially stories about marginalized groups, might impact your ability to get your story to move forward in the process. So, and again, it will also do unintentional harm. And I don't think anyone is intending to do that. So, invest in the time even before you send it out to a literary agent. I think it's always worthwhile.
Always great for us to do our due diligence as writers to the audience. So we have talked all about your new debut as well as a little bit about what's to come for your writing career. So, where can listeners find your books and how can they connect with you?
Oh my goodness. I'm wide.
Yay!
I, so I am wide. You can get me on Amazon. I am available through Barnes and Noble. You can order me through the Ripped Bodice. There's if you're in Western New York, Merit Badge Books in Hamburg, New York carries my books in store, as well as Bush Hill Florist in Perry, New York, which is adorable. It's my hometown. And the florist shop is selling my books, and they're so cute because my next book, which comes out in July, it's a small town romance, and it's actually set in my hometown. We're doing a big event for the launch there in my hometown. My husband and I are flying in for it, and they're just adorable. They're like, "Oh, we're gonna sell your books," and it's so cute. My aunt works
Oh.
at the florist shop, and she says people come in and they get flowers and a copy of your book. It's adorable. But so you can get my book anywhere. It's also on Audible. It's ebook, paperback, and audiobook. I know most indie authors will wait to do an audiobook, but as a person with a disability who accesses books through audiobook, I have invested in making sure my books are audiobooks from the get-go. So the book that comes out in July will also have an audiobook. And then, of course, at First Smile, I'm not going to release a Legally Blind female main character book and not have an audiobook. So I am on Instagram at Melissa_Whitney author, and on TikTok at Melissa Sue Whitney. And I didn't really think about that name when I started my TikTok before my author. And I was like, oh, I guess everybody knows my middle name now. And I also have my own website, melissawhitneywrites.com. And of course, you can sign up for my newsletter. I send a lot of like fun things out through my newsletter monthly, sneak peeks, opportunities to do beta reads, contests, fun questions. I love engaging with readers. So pretty much you can find me anywhere.
Thanks so much to Melissa for joining the show. If you like this kind of content, don't forget to subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. That way, you're the first to hear new episodes when they drop. And if you get a chance, feel free to leave a review. It helps support the show and allows more opportunity to bring in all kinds of fantastic guests. There's also a link to the YouTube channel in the description if you like to see the interviews with some of the guests and see them show off their lovely books. As always, stay safe, be well, and keep writing. Bye!